All right, we are live for another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast. In today's episode, we are breaking a cherry, and that cherry that we are breaking is that of one of our performance dietitian, Ryan Hasell. You know him better as the Dojo Dietitian, but this, to many people's surprise, is actually his very first podcast that he is doing on the TFD podcast. So, Ryan, thanks for coming on, mate. Welcome to your very first podcast.
Thanks, Geordie. Honor to be here. And so for today's podcast, I think we're going to be going through breaking down creatine. So I've got some info here, and if you're ready, we'll just get straight into it.
Yeah, I think let's just jump straight into it, right? Like, this is a part of the podcast of this series that what we want to do is we want to give you guys the most bite-sized, action-packed, most important info about some of the most common topics that we get asked in everything regards to nutrition science. So today's episode is going to be all about creatine. Dojo has all of this broken down for us. If you are not watching this on YouTube and you're listening to it on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, then sucks to be you because you're not going to be able to see the slides, but Ryan will be able to go through all of this in a lot of detail. I highly encourage you, if you are listening to this, jump over to the YouTube channel, give it, because there's going to be a really cool presentation with this. In the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to break down all of the most common questions and give you guys all of the most up-to-date recent information that we have about creatine. So I'm going to leave it to Dojo. Take it away. Give the people what they want to hear.
All right, well, let's get into it. So creatine. Creatine is one of the most popular and definitely one of the most researched supplements out there, especially for sports performance. So creatine, it actually occurs naturally within our bodies. We produce it through our kidneys and our liver, but it can also be, our stores of it can also be increased through what we eat in our diet and through supplements. Creatine was first discovered in muscle cells, but we know now that it can also be found in a couple of other tissues in the body, including the brain, which is something interesting that we'll get to a little bit later on. Now, creatine itself provides energy and works as a storage of energy in the body as well. And it provides our energy in the form of a molecule that we call ATP. So let's have a chat about a couple of the potential benefits of taking creatine. Now, the main ones are centered around increasing exercise performance. And this is specifically exercises that last over a couple of seconds. So if you're thinking like things like a 100-meter sprint or some sort of powerlifting or weightlifting movement, something that's really short but requires a lot of energy, this is where you're going to get the most bang for your buck out of creatine supplementation. It also seems to improve adaptations to training. And this is like through combining that first, like improving short burst exercise. But then like if you're thinking about doing that over the course of a whole training program, you're doing heaps more rounds of like shorter, higher intensity exercise, the adaptations that you see from your training are going to be better. There's also evidence to show that it can help with enhancing post-exercise recovery. And this is centered around like storage of glycogen, which is our body's way of storing carbohydrates. And there's some evidence to show that if you take creatine within that process as well, it helps to increase our body's ability to store glycogen. Now, the next two are kind of like more loosely being explored. There's not a huge amount of science behind them, but there is some evidence to suggest that taking creatine can help with injury prevention. Now, this is a bit like, there's a bit of speculation on this one. It's more that like people that take creatine seem to get injured less rather than like there's a mechanism that we understand in terms of like how that happens. Whether or not that's just because they have more energy or they're able to complete these exercises at like a better quality, and maybe that's why they don't get injured. We're not 100% sure, but there seems to be something there. And then the last one, and this is something your mate Dan might be able to take you through in a little bit more detail, but there seems to be a really cool interaction here where creatine might be protective or at least like helpful in the little like window of time after a traumatic brain injury or like a concussion or head knock, you know, like those sort of things. And we can get to like how that works in a minute, but yeah, that seems to be a really exciting, like emerging field of creatine research. There's not a huge amount of evidence for it in humans yet, but that's pretty promising evidence in like animal studies and that kind of thing. Now, aside from like positives for sport, creatine also has a couple of potential uses just in general health. So a first obvious one is like for people that are born with deficiencies in being able to produce it themselves. There's a clear space for it to work there. But it also seems to be helpful in like therapy or protection against neurodegenerative diseases. It also seems to be helpful with ischemic heart disease and with helping to control the body's blood glucose levels, which can basically be downstream of a lot of really like chronic diseases. So in order to really understand how creatine works or like why it works, it's important to also understand like the body's energy systems. So we have these three main energy systems, and you might have seen this graph before, or you might have like a little bit of an understanding of, you know, these things like anaerobic or aerobic exercise and all of that kind of thing. But just to break it down, where we're looking at the three different lines on this graph here, the first one, the red one, you see like a big spike really quickly, and then it drops off really quickly. And that is the phosphocreatine system. So essentially all of the energy during that time is being generated by your body's creatine. As that starts to dip off, then you start seeing energy being produced more and more by anaerobic systems. And then as that starts to drop off, then you get more into like, you know, your endurance exercise, where it's being primarily fueled by the aerobic systems. So how does that work? Well, with creatine, as I mentioned before, it provides energy in the form of this ATP, which is a molecule that in our body, which is like ATP is short for adenosine triphosphate. And without getting into it like too deeply, it's basically just one adenosine molecule and three phosphate molecules, so like triphosphate. What happens is as you exercise, we lose one of the phosphates and it becomes adenosine diphosphate. So it's an adenosine with two phosphates. In order to like use it for energy again, it needs to be converted back to that ATP with three phosphates. So one way that we can do this is, and a really quick and efficient way that we can do this, is with creatine phosphate. So the way that creatine is stored in the body is with a phosphate molecule, and it's really easy for the body to break that apart and put that phosphate back on the ADP and have it be ready to be used for exercise again. The process the other way around, so to then recreate the creatine phosphate, can take a little bit longer, and that's why we see this huge spike in energy, but then it drops off as the creatine gets used up. Now, in terms of like how it helps with enhanced recovery, this is, as I said, it's to do with the glycogen storage in the body. So it's our body's ability to store carbs that get used up during exercise. So they've done some studies comparing groups where one group had just high dose carbs, I guess you would call it. So around 50 to 100 grams of glucose following a training session, versus people that had the same amount, but with 5 grams of creatine. And the evidence suggested that the group that had the creatine as well were able to store more glycogen and therefore like enhance their recovery post-exercise. Now this one's like, as I said, a little bit more speculative, but kind of interesting. So this is how creatine works in that sort of like concussive therapy or recovery or protection, whatever you want to call it, or like which angle you want to take it from. But essentially what happens when we have like traumatic brain injuries, concussions, head knocks, even like subconcussive stuff, whenever the brain is getting like knocked, there tends to be what we call like an energy crisis. And like there's a lot going on physiologically that causes that, but essentially it's like an upkick in inflammation that sort of burns a whole lot of energy really, really quickly. And then you end up with this sort of energy deficit in that area of the brain, where like, as we said, there can be a little bit of creatine stored in the brain and those levels drop off really quickly. So kind of like the idea here is by sort of having more creatine in that short window following a concussion or something like that, there's the potential that maybe we can help to offset that huge drop in ATP and potentially help with that recovery a little bit. Now, to talk about the safety of creatine. So creatine actually seems to be relatively safe for like most people, like healthy people and clinical people, with dosages from around 0.3 to 0.8 grams per kilogram per day, which is actually like, that's quite a lot of creatine. Now, one of the questions that gets raised sometimes is like, is it safe for the kidneys? So, and this is like you kind of have to understand the physiology of the kidneys a little bit here, but essentially when creatine is broken down, one of the like waste products is creatinine, which is like, it's a separate thing, but it's one of the markers that we look for when we look at, is someone's kidneys, are someone's kidneys like failing? Are they working? Creatinine is one of the markers that we'll look at. And this is like loosely relevant within the combat sports scene, because when you're going through these like intense weight cuts, or some athletes, when they like really push themselves in those end stage weight cuts and potentially like overcook it a little bit, there is a level of renal impairment there. And then so the question is like, is it safe to be taking creatine and producing all this creatinine, which then has to be filtered through the kidneys, which are they in like a compromised state, and is that damaging? Now that like, obviously there hasn't been any studies done on this like in athletes in that like weight cut situation, but people have looked at it within like hospital population, so people that are like in hospital with kidney failure or whatever, and they actually found that the creatine supplementation for these people seems to be helpful, and not really related to that whole creatinine side of things, but actually there's another molecule that's produced when the kidneys are damaged called homocysteine, and this can cause things like blood clots and damage to arteries and that kind of thing. And they actually found that creatine can help to reduce homocysteine levels in that like acute renal setting, and actually improve the people's outcomes. So the patients end up with better outcomes taking creatine than not taking it. But as always, like, that kind of comes with the caveat of, if you're unsure, like if you think you might have impaired kidneys or there may be some underlying issues there, definitely talk to a GP first before you jump in and start taking creatine, and they'll be able to advise you as to whether or not they think it's going to be safe. But for most general people, creatine is going to be safe. So let's have a chat about practicality, like how do we use creatine? So there's kind of two trains of thought here. The traditional method was to go through a loading phase and then into a maintenance phase, with the loading phase being a pretty high dosage of somewhere roughly around 0.3 kilograms per day for about a week. Now, like for someone my size, like I'm about 100 kilos, that's like 30 grams of creatine per day for a week. And like, I don't know if you've had high dose creatine, Geordie, but it can cause a couple of like gastro issues. Like you can get some bloating, gas, and like fair bit of discomfort if you're chuffing that much creatine in a day. So I tend to not do the loading phase. I tend to go straight to the maintenance phase. And this is more of like a more recent thing, but the science shows that if you just start out at the maintenance dose, so we're talking like 3 to 5 grams here, over about a 3 to 4 week period, your stores will be up to that of if you've done the loading phase over a week anyway. So as long as you've got the time, and like if you don't want to get all those like symptoms of just smashing heaps of creatine really quickly, going it a little bit slower over a little bit of a longer period of time, you're going to get the same benefits out of it as you would, loading it. And yeah, so that basically wraps up the info that I prepared on the slides. Did you have any other questions or anything you think people might be wanting to know about, Geordie?
I guess a few things that I always do get asked. I think one of the biggest ones is for an athlete, and I know you went over this, but it's important to go over it again. What are the actual benefits? So what are if you were to summarize for an athlete, what are the actual benefits? And then I'll follow this up with a question for, say, if you're not an athlete listening to this, what are the benefits? But if an athlete came to you and said, hey, what's to go with creatine? what am I actually getting out of it if I'm going to do this? What would you tell them?
So I would say, like, for most athletes, the biggest benefit is going to come from like the training adaptations. So like, to kind of tie that into combat sports specifically, but into any sport really where there's high intensity bursts, like, so you think like an MMA athlete, when they've got to do like a blast double or like some takedown or something like that, it requires a lot of energy really quickly. And then if they're drilling those sort of things in training, having creatine to supplement like while they're doing that sort of training, they're going to get a lot bigger of a payoff over time than someone who's not. And as well as that, on the S&C side of things, so like when you're doing a lot of weightlifting and stuff as part of your training program as well, that's where you're going to get a lot of benefit out of creatine. Like in terms of power, strength, a lot of these things we see benefits in from taking creatine.
The next question I get all the time that people say to me, they always ask, well, if I take creatine, aren't I just going to blow up with water? Like, aren't I just going to swell up with water? What's the go with that? Do you put water on, like water weight on? If you do, how long does it stick around, or what's the go with it?
So as far as I'm aware, the only like weight gain that we see, like the water retention, seems to be during that loading phase. So when people are smashing heaps of creatine, and that seems to be like a maximum, I think the biggest I saw was like 2% increase in weight from water retention. But if you're doing the maintenance dose, so if you just start from a lower dose, there's unlikely to be like any change at all, or like insignificant amount that you would actually see it show up on the scales.
Yeah, I think Scott Forbes and his team has shown that in a recent study, that when they controlled for all the other factors and at the maintenance phase, there really wasn't any change in water weight. Obviously, you can have lots of factors that affect your weight, but they controlled for as many as possible and they just didn't see it. And like you said, it's that loading phase. And for anyone that's done it, like we can talk about all, I remember doing it the first time probably over a decade ago when I was a bit more of a brass lord and gym lifting back in the day. It's hard, like getting that in. Like you said, there's a lot of gastro side effects that you get with that loading phase and doing that much creatine every day. And I always say to our guys, just do the maintenance. Just do the maintenance for the extra couple of weeks. You end up with the saturated stores anyway. So why bother going through all of that?
Yeah, totally agree.
I think the next thing that I want to go over, and I know you mentioned this again with the kidneys and going, you know, it is safe to take, but can you just go over quickly, what is it that people are worried about? Why is it when you say creatine, there's this like almost visceral knee-jerk reaction when people are like, oh, no, it's not good for me. It's not good for my kidneys. Why is it? Is it destructive when it goes through the nephron, or what's the theory behind why people think it could potentially be destructive?
Like my understanding is that it's like, so the kidneys are basically the body's like filtration system. So anything that like comes out in your urine is like being filtered in the kidneys. So one of the trains of thought here is that like by having more creatinine, which is that waste product of creatine metabolism, also like a waste product of muscle breakdown and stuff, by increasing the amount of creatinine, you're increasing the amount of stuff that needs to get filtered through the kidneys. And if the kidneys are already in this like inflamed state, they're a bit damaged already, and you're trying to just force stuff through them, there's the potential there that maybe you're increasing the amount of damage that's being done to the kidneys. But it just doesn't seem, from what I've seen in the research, to actually happen.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I've even had patients that, you know, have some type of acute kidney injury or even stage 1 kidney injuries, and they seem to not have any complications when you give it to them. So again, like you said, you do want to talk to a health professional, go see your GP if you are considering it. But for the most part, as far as we know, creatine is probably, if not one of, if not the most safest supplement because of how widely spread it's been studied.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about non-athletes. So I recommend creatine for everyone. I get my parents on it. I get my grandparents to take it. What are the benefits that if someone's listening to this and they just say work on a job site or they're an office or they're a business owner or whatever, and they go, okay, well, is there a benefit for creatine for me?
Yeah, absolutely. And like, and this comes back to the energy systems and like just providing general energy for your body, but in particular the brain as well. So as I mentioned, there's creatine stores in the brain, and that it's definitely something that's starting to pick up in the research, is that by supplementing creatine, you actually can like just by saturating those stores in the brain, so just by like making sure that they're full, you can actually improve like things like cognitive performance. All of that sort of stuff can come along with creatine supplementation. It's not just stuff that you see in the gym. There is the whole like mental side of it as well that can improve if you go from having like, it's like, the analogy is kind of like having a battery, right? And you're operating at like 75%, where if you had it at 100%, you could go for a bit longer. Potentially, yeah, there's just all sorts of benefits there from coming from having more energy available, basically.
Yeah, I think obviously, like you said, the science right now is in a pretty novel stage. I work with a lot of corporate guys, like high-end corporate guys, and it's one of the first subs that I recommend. I always get them asking me, hey, like, are there any nootropics or something that I can take for enhanced brain function? It's like, well, there's probably a lot of other low-hanging fruits that you can do to get enhanced brain function, overall calorie intake, hydration, good sleep, stress management. But one of the things that I'm constantly recommending to these guys is, hey, go get creatine and do a maintenance phase of creatine. Do it for 4 to 6 weeks and let's see how you feel. And it's crazy how good the feedback is. Obviously, there's many factors when you're making big, broad changes with your nutrition and lifestyle, but I haven't yet had someone who has come back with any negative feedback about taking creatine for those mental or cognitive performance benefits.
Yeah, no, it just seems to kind of be something positive across the board.
So is there anything else that we need to cover about creatine? I think we've gone over what it is, why you would take it, how much you would take it, if you're weighing up, okay, is it for me, is it risky or not? We've covered that. Most of that is pretty unfounded. Anything else that we need to go over, Dojo, before we let the people go?
No, I think that covers it from all the things that I can think of. But like, if anyone has any questions, obviously just shoot them through to the team. We can always answer those. And if anyone wants to see like any research or anything that we've talked about, more than happy to like link that stuff as well.
All right, well, there you go. Our first episode of the TFD Performance Podcast with our very own, the Dojo Dietitian. We're going to keep these type of episodes going, guys. We're going to be doing all different types of supplements. We're going to be talking about different physiological systems, concepts within nutrition science. If there's something that you want to hear us break down, maybe you learned something at university, you read something in a paper, you heard some other person in the nutrition space or some testicle eating beefed up dude talk about something and you want to get some clarification on it, hit us in the DMs, shoot us an email, shoot us a message, let us know, and we'll break down the science of it. But there is everything you need to know about creatine. So Dojo, thanks for coming on, mate. We'll get back at it again very soon.
Thanks, Jordy. Thanks for having me on.